1953, the National Party implemented Act No. 47, otherwise known as the Bantu Education Act, which increased the government's control of the education system that forced Africans into menial occupations that further degraded their status in South African society. The act was designed to take away the right of all citizens to have equal access to quality education and cause the government to neglect the responsibility of providing and protecting that right. The Bantu Education Act was just one of many laws enforced by the South African government to deprive Black South Africans of their rights during the Apartheid. However, steps were successfully taken to end apartheid and restore the rights of all South African citizens, regardless of race. The new constitution was drafted in 1994 after the first democratic elections with a new president, Nelson Mandela, and put into effect in 1996. Though the apartheid officially started in 1948, years of conflict between the white Afrikaners and the native Black Africans stretched back to the 1600s. In 1652, the first Dutch settlers, known as Boers, arrived in South Africa by ship. Throughout the 1700s, they spread through South Africa and seized the territory of the native peoples, forcing them to work on the Boers' land to survive. The Boers excused their cruelty by claiming that they were the superior race. The gap between the whites and the blacks continued to grow, and in 1867 diamond mining began. In the diamond mines, segregation was very apparent, as the Black Africans occupied the most dangerous jobs, were paid less, and lived in patrolled barracks. Throughout the 1900s, the disparities between the blacks and the whites rapidly increased. The differences in success were blindingly obvious. While blacks made up 74% of the population, whites had 75% of the wealth and owned 87% of the land. The history of Black and white South Africans was filled with tension from the very beginning and reached a high point in 1948 when the National Party won the elections and apartheid officially began.
The apartheid not only separated whites from blacks but also stripped native South Africans of their citizenship and restrained them from holding any political office. In 1951, new independent states called Bantustans, or homelands, were created where blacks had to live. This relocation also stripped blacks of their right to vote, since they were not considered citizens anymore. Over 9 million South Africans lost their right to vote. Children grew up thinking, quote, white is right because of the clear superiority of white people's lifestyle compared to other races. As Eddie Daniels, a former prison mate with Nelson Mandela, said, for 300 years, the black child was inferior and the white child was superior. The son of a white father inherited his father's wealth and property. But the black farm worker's child, what does he inherit? He inherits ignorance and poverty.
So, seeing Africans was just an absolutely common part of life and interacting with them all the time. But at the same time, there was this kind of wall, which was that you just couldn't, there wasn't really an opportunity to be friends.
Into this segregated nation, another racist act was implemented, this time affecting one of the most important parts of society, education. The Bantu Act of 1953 greatly affected the South African education system and was passed on October 5th. The main purpose of the act was, quote, to provide for the transfer of the administration and control of native education from the several provincial administrations to the government of the Union and for matters incidental thereto.
Schools in the homelands were now totally controlled by the white nationalist government. Previously, 90% of black schools were run by missionaries. All self-run mission schools were shut down by the act, meaning that now there was no other education options other than the government-run schools. The new curriculum in the act was set up so that it taught blacks how to do only menial jobs, preventing them from moving up the social scale. The act also conveniently gave the government total control over how teachers taught, what they taught, and what punishments were doled out. Now teachers could only teach in Afrikaans, a notoriously hard language to learn. As a result, many teachers lost their jobs, and if students wanted to continue their education, they were forced to learn a language they didn't even want to learn. Despite all this, the number of black students increased due to the government's need for trained labor. Overcrowding became normal, and the ratio of students to teachers went up from 46-1 to 58-1 in 1955 and 1967. Obed Bapela, South African Deputy Minister, talks about how schools were during this time.
There were not enough schools to take all of us. So we used to share classes. Then there will be a morning class that goes up to 11 o'clock. And then we'll go home. And then other kids on the same grade will come then after 11 o'clock up to 2 o'clock. And therefore the teachers will then run two sets of classes the same grade, others coming in the morning and others coming later during the day until the afternoon.
In addition to this, teachers became less and less qualified than even some of their students. Eddie Daniels, one of the few black teachers who taught at a white school, is interviewed by a representative of Michigan State University. In this, he talks about the differences between black and white schools during the apartheid.
The first thing that strikes me, both schools, when I got there, the first thing is huge stretches of green fields. Hell, man. And the black schools have got nothing, you know. And I look at this, you know, and it's just vast stretches, and all playing fields, there's different playing fields, and the tennis courts, and, you know, it's painful, you know, painful.
The oppressive education, of course, did not last. After the Bantu Education Act came into effect on April 1, 1955, the ANC, or African National Congress, started a boycott of the schools. However, this failed as the government threatened to expel all students who didn't return to school by April 25th. As a result, many students were expelled, and the ANC started the African education movement to run informal schools. But these did not last, and were closed by 1960. On June 4, 1976, in Soweto, or Southwestern Township, students and teachers started to protest against the schools by going on strike, largely due to the fact that they were forced to learn in Afrikaans. 12 days later, over 10,000 students marched from Soweto, holding banners and signs condemning the government. They were closely monitored by the police, but the protests quickly turned violent, with protesters throwing stones at the police, and the police firing tear gas and eventually bullets into the crowd of teenagers and children. The protests spread quickly, and the government declared a state of emergency. The police responded very violently to all of the protests. Many were arrested. In total, over 600 people died, mostly civilians, as the pent-up anger of an oppressed nation was released.
In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the international community began to take notice of the injustices going on in South Africa. During the 1980s, an international campaign was launched by governments from around the world to boycott the South African government by cutting off trade with them. The actions weakened the South African economy and government. During the 1980s, black South Africans started to ignore the boundaries set in place by the homelands and started pouring out of the homelands in search of work. All the while, protests increased. Due to the increasing civil disorder and international pressure, many laws were repealed that promoted segregation. Finally, in 1991, the rest of the apartheid laws were repealed by President F.W. de Klerk.
In 1994, the apartheid was finally over. This was marked by the abolishment of the old constitution and the election of South Africa's first black president, Nelson Mandela. A new constitution was put in place in 1996, along with a new Education Act, Act No. 84, that addressed the problems of the Bantu Education Act. The Constitution gave everyone the right to a basic education in their language of choice. Act No. 84 reads, quote, "This country requires a new national system for schools, which will redress past injustices in educational provision," end quote. It also specifically talked about contesting racism and other forms of discrimination in schools, saying the act would, quote, "advance the democratic transformation of society, combat racism and sexism, and all other forms of unfair discrimination and intolerance," end quote. After the reforms of Nelson Mandela, the conditions of the schools drastically improved. Around 7% of their GDP goes to education, one of the highest in the world.
The Bantu Education Act had a profound effect on South Africa. The goal of the government was to have more control over black South Africans. They did this by denying them the right to an equal education and neglecting their responsibility to provide a good education for all people. However, the South Africans would not allow their education to be ruined, so they started to protest, the largest of which was the Soweto Uprising. Countries from around the world also became involved by boycotting South Africa. Through these protests, South Africans reclaimed their right to the same education as whites, and the new South African government fulfilled their responsibility to provide equal education for the entire nation.